The Enchanted Library. The dark storm clouds had gathered, pummeling the streets of Crowgable, so that the mud turned to sludge, and huge puddles formed where people needed to walk. The water leaked through the stall canopies, dripping onto the merchants that were trying to sell their pitiful wares. The food stalls were lacking in anything interesting, as the harvest that year had been dreadful. The meat market had suffered because of it, because the animals had either died off, or there was very little substance to them. In fact, if the farmers thought about it, it had always been that way, even in their parents' time. It was just the way things were in Crowgable. An old man was making his way home in the pouring rain. He swayed slightly, to and fro, the effects of the 4 jugs of ale he had consumed at the Laughing Giant. A funny name for a tavern where A, there was no giant to be seen, and B, nobody laughed. The landlord silently poured his jugs of ale with a melancholy face, and the girl collected the empty ones from the tables with a complete lack of interest. And it wasn't just the tavern where nobody laughed. Nobody, as far as he was aware, had ever laughed at all. It was just the way things were in Crowgable. Smoke drifted from the chimney pots to join the storm clouds, and a raven sat on the roof of the dark and slowly crumbling building that acted as the town jail. It was on the top floor of this building, right beneath where the raven was sitting, that an old woman stared through the bars of a small window towards where a scaffold was being built in the main square. It was a gallows, and it was being erected for her. The name of this old woman was Magdalena Bloodworth, but she had other names too: Mad Mag, Bloody Mag, and Blood Witch. For that was what the locals believed she was: a witch. A witch who was casting black spells on the town and its residents, who made the crops fail, who infected the wells, who was responsible for disease. Magdalena lived not in the town, but in an ancient castle on the outskirts. It had belonged to the Bloodworth family for many generations, and in fact the Bloodworths had, in the past, been very well thought of. Her ancestor had been Mayor Bloodworth 120 years ago. But Magdalena had preferred to keep herself to herself, hidden away in her family's grand home. And it was because of this that the locals began to talk. Whisperings of dark things that went on at the castle. Could it be black magic? Could that old woman, the descendant of the famous Bloodworths, actually be a witch? What evil deeds was she stirring up behind the stone walls of Bloodworth Castle? And that's when the names had begun to be banded around. Little boys ran about the streets at night, shouting out that Mad Mag, the Blood Witch, was coming. If children didn't behave themselves, their parents would warn them that Bloody Mag would come and snatch them out of their beds, and they would never be seen again. At that, the children would usually calm down right away. But these were merely rumours, nightmares and wild imaginings, because nobody really knew or understood Magdalena Bloodworth. They had never talked to her, had never even so much as said good morning to her when she came to the markets every Monday. Instead, they eyed her suspiciously and kept quiet when she came into view. Eventually, a petition had been signed by hundreds of people, farmers angry about their crops, women with permanent ailments, and others who complained about the bad weather. It had been given to the magistrate. It was a petition to have that old woman tried for witchcraft. All these problems were down to her. The magistrate agreed, and a band of constables had been sent to arrest her. Her trial had been swift and one-sided. She was not allowed to testify on her own behalf. "Magdalena Bloodworth," intoned the judge, "you have been found guilty of creating these terrible things by means of witchcraft. The sentence for that is execution by hanging. It will be carried out in 3 days. Until then you will be confined to the condemned cell. It is my hope," he said, turning now to those public who had crammed into the courtroom to watch, "that life will become much better in Crowgable after this witch is dead." But what the people of Crowgable did not understand was that if she died on those gallows, there would never be any chance of improvement. Not now, not ever. Because Magdalena knew that the answer to their wishes lay not in killing her, but within the books of Bloodworth Castle's Enchanted Library. It was there that she'd shut herself away for all this time, trying to find the spell that had been lost for 3 centuries, a spell that would allow her to use the enchanted books. Alice Birdwhistle was in the market, trying to get eggs for her mother. She was 16 years old, with short, light brown hair that flounced around the nape of her neck as she walked. Although today, because of the rain, she was wearing a hooded cloak. People called her a special child, as she was always very happy. She greeted everyone she met in the street, and people would frown at her sometimes, before either greeting her back or nodding slightly and scuttling on. They were not used to such a disposition. Alice had never understood that. Why shouldn't a person be happy? When she laughed, wherever she was, the sound seemed to travel across rooftops and through windows. At first people were curious, or sometimes even afraid at such a sound. But now they were used to it. "Oh, it's just Alice," they would say. "She's a bit odd, but she's harmless." This afternoon, as she walked through the stalls to where the eggs were, people seemed to be in deep and almost excitable conversation about something, despite the wet weather. "Good afternoon, Miss Birdwhistle," said the egg merchant. "Another dozen for your mother?" "Yes, please, Mr. Bobrick," chirped the girl. Bobrick nodded and began hand-picking them. "And how are you today, Alice?" he asked, with an uninterested tone he always had. "Very well, Mr. Bobrick." She paused. There was a question she wanted to ask him, but she wasn't sure if she should. She bit her lip and said tentatively, "Mr. Bobrick, can I ask you a question?" "Yes," was the response. "Do you ever wish for anything?" He stopped picking eggs and stared at her. Alice swallowed. But then his face creased and he said, slowly, "Well, I sometimes wish I had 100 hens. Then I could sell more eggs." He suddenly winked at her, and something that could be described as a smile played on his lips, like he was telling her something he shouldn't, but that was part of the fun. Alice smiled back. "Thank you," she said. "I ask people this question a lot, and I always seem to get the same answer." "What is that?" asked Mr. Bobrick. "They don't have any." "They do," said a voice at her side. It was Elder Sallow, a woman Alice knew. She worked in the infirmary, tending to the sick. They just don't voice them. Or they put them to the back of their minds and forget about them. Because what is the point? Crowgable is a melancholy place. There's hardly any colour. It seems to perpetually sit beneath a dark cloud. I have spoken to many who come to the infirmary, some of them with ailments of the mind. Every night they dream of only sad things, hopes for the future, smashed like a broken vase or wilted flowers. They wish for better times, but they feel guilty when they have those thoughts. I have told them that there is nothing to be ashamed about having hopes. Hopes are what keep us going, that one day things will be better. But now something has happened, something which the townsfolk believe will create change. I suppose you've noticed that people are talking? Yes, replied Alice. What's going on? The old woman, Magdalena Bloodworth, has been found guilty of doing witchcraft against the populace. It is she who makes everything the way it is in this town. When Alice heard this, she almost dropped the eggs Bobrick had just handed her. Hot prickles began to erupt under her skin. Her heart began to thud. Are you all right, dear? Asked Mrs. Sallow. I'm fine. Listen, I have to take these eggs back to my mother. She's waiting for them. And with that, Alice Birdwhistle turned and darted into the crowd. It was 10 o'clock. The lamps had been lit in the streets, reflecting in the puddles, turning them orange. Usually Alice loved to gaze into them, wishing that that bright little pool of water would suddenly become animated, leave its lowly dwelling place, and go shooting off into the darkness like a giant firefly. But not tonight. Tonight she ran through them, not caring what it was doing to her cloak. She was running frantically towards the prison. When she arrived, she made her way around to the back of the building, where the condemned cell looked out. She looked anxiously around for any sign of people, listened carefully for voices or the sound of footfall on the wet street. And when she felt it was safe, she called up to the window in as quiet a shout as she could. "Magdalena," she hissed. "It's me, Alice." The old woman's face appeared at the window a moment later. "Oh, thank the stars and moon you have come, girl," said Magdalena, her voice full of relief. "I heard what happened," Alice said. "I had to see you." "My dear girl, you must listen to me very carefully." Alice nodded sincerely. "You are my last hope. You remember what I told you, about what I have been working on?" "Yes, about the secret of the Enchanted Library." "Yes. Well, I think I've worked it out. The spell. But I had no time to do an incantation, for I was arrested soon after. Nobody will listen to me. They will not let me tell them the truth. Alice, with everything I have taught you, you must try to open those books. Then bring them to the magistrate before midday on Tuesday. Let him see for himself. Can you do this for me?" Alice nodded firmly. "I will do everything I can, Magdalena, I promise." Magdalena now dropped a key through the bars. Alice caught it. "The key to the library. My notes are in there. You will find them on the table by the fire. Go!" As Alice ran home, the raven took off from its perch on the roof and flew after her. When she arrived home, her mother was waiting anxiously for her in the kitchen. "Well?" she asked. "How is she?" "Worried, as you can imagine. She's asked me to do something for her. I have to go to the castle right away." She grabbed a bag that was hanging on the wall near the range and began stuffing it with food. She paused and looked at her mother. "I don't know how long I'm going to be there." "Oh, child," said her mother, her tone fraught with concern. "I'm not a child. Stop calling me that. You're my child. No matter how old you are, I will always worry about you." Alice smiled. "I'll be fine." She went into her room and came back with a number of candles and a bag of herbs. "What has she asked you to do? What are you going to be dabbling with?" "Magic, Mother. I have to perform a spell. She has taught me well over the years. I know I can do this." "Well, she chose a wonderful protege," said her mother with feeling. Alice smiled again as she finished packing her bag. But inwardly she was doubtful whether or not she would succeed. As cheery as she was, she often doubted her own gifts and abilities. Once Alice had stepped outside, she ran as fast as she could to the coaching house. Only one was sitting outside. The horse was sopping wet, its bedraggled mane getting in its eyes, billows of steam rising from its nostrils. The driver was nowhere to be seen. She ran inside. "Where is the driver of that coach?" she asked. An old man stood up from one of the benches. "Here I am, young lady. Needing a lift on this dreadful night, are you?" "I am." "Well then, let's go. Where are you headed?" "Bloodworth Castle." The coachman stopped. The man at reception glanced up. "Where did you say?" asked the old man. Alice sighed. "I wish to go to Bloodworth Castle." "What business would you have there?" Alice looked at him steadily. "My business is my own. Will you take me or not?" The coachman grunted and jerked his head in the direction of the door. The driver lashed his horse, and the coach began to move. Alice leaned against the padded backrest that had seen better days and stared out the window into the darkness. She had first met Magdalena Bloodworth when she was a girl of 9. She had gone out one day to pick mushrooms in the woods on the edge of town. She loved to go foraging for things. Mushrooms, blackberries, wildflowers, and always she would sing to herself or hum little tunes. For apart from the rustling of leaves, there was no sound like it. The birds did not sing. At one point she straightened up after bending down to pick up a mushroom and saw, standing a few feet in front of her, an old woman. She must have just emerged from the trees, because she certainly wasn't there before. Alice had started, but the old woman had held up her hand. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you. I heard your beautiful singing and came to see." Alice smiled. "Do you like it?" she asked. "I certainly do. I haven't heard somebody sing in many years." "Oh, I sing all the time," replied Alice cheerily. "My name is Magdalena, but people just call me Mag. What's your name, love?" "Alice. Alice Birdwhistle." "An appropriate name," said Magdalena. "Are you foraging as well?" asked Alice. "As a matter of fact, I am," replied Magdalena, holding up a little bag. "Do you live nearby?" asked Alice. "It's about a mile away. A big castle on the edge of the woods." Alice's eyes widened. "A castle!" she exclaimed. "Yes, it's my ancestral home. I've never lived anywhere else." "Can I come?" asked Alice excitedly. "Oh, please! I've never seen a real castle before. I've only seen carvings and drawings." Magdalena smiled with delight at the sheer joy that this little girl imbued. "Of course you can. It would be my absolute pleasure to show you round, and in fact you'll be the first visitor for a long, long time." It had taken them half an hour to walk to Bloodworth Castle. When Alice saw the huge building with its tall turrets rising up from behind the defensive wall, her eyes bulged out of their sockets. "It's beautiful," she gasped. "Wait until you see inside," replied Magdalena. She pushed on the iron gates, the top of which were arched, and they opened slowly inwards. Within the wall the grounds, which must have been once magnificent, were now overgrown. Alice raised her head to cast her eyes over the castle's facade. Ancient stones, with a large set of windows looking out over the surrounding woods. Magdalena followed her gaze. "That's the great hall up there. I'll take you in. It's magnificent, built to impress." When they entered the castle, Alice was even more aghast. Vaulted ceilings like church cloisters, a beautiful carpet that covered the floor and stairs, old portraits on the walls. The smell was musty, which made her wrinkle her nose. Magdalena took her up the stairs and down a long corridor with the same impressive ceiling. She took her to the great hall. Alice had never seen anything like it. It was a vast space with a high roof of ancient oak beams. The large windows were at the far end. Huge faded tapestries hung on the walls, and a long table with ornate candelabras took centre stage. Between two of the tapestries was hung a gigantic portrait. It was of a young bearded man wearing a fur cloak with a gold clasp. "Who is that?" asked Alice. "That is my ancestor. He is the man who built this castle. His name was Baxter Bloodworth." Alice stared at the picture for a while, imagining what the man must have been like. "Why is he not smiling?" she asked finally. Subjects had to sit there for a long time, so the artist could paint them, and you can only smile for a certain amount of time before your cheek muscles begin to hurt. "People in the town never seem to smile. They're always grumpy. Only my mother smiles sometimes." "It's interesting you should say that," said Magdalena. "Why?" "To answer that question, I would have to tell you the story of Baxter Bloodworth." Hundreds of years ago, Baxter Bloodworth arrived in the town of Crowgable with his beautiful wife, Alvina. He was a very rich man and had plans to build a castle nearby for him and his wife. The townsfolk were in awe of him as he rode in his sumptuous carriage and horses. His story goes that as the carriage passed a group of ragged boys, Baxter threw a shower of gold coins out the window for him. He was a lovely human being, very generous and kind, always laughing. I would very much like to have met my ancestor. He had dinner with the town elders that evening and told them of his plans to build a castle on the edge of Gable Woods. The elders were only too happy to have a man like Baxter nearby. The castle was built over the course of the next 3 years. During that time, Baxter lived in a large manor house in the centre of town. On his first week there, he held a huge lavish party for the townspeople, inviting them all, children included. Wine and rich food flowed freely, and the party went on well into the night. This immediately established him as the most popular man in town. People wanted him to run for mayor, but he humbly declined the offer, saying that he would rather just help in his own way where he could. And he did. He paid for a school to be built for the poor children. He paid for more wells to be dug and improvements to buildings. He was constantly being showered with gifts by grateful people. His wife, Alvina, a young, dark-haired beauty, also did her part. She had a passion for books and reading, and established the printing house, where many works have since been printed. I'm sure you've probably passed there a number of times. Alice nodded. At last the castle was completed, and Baxter and Alvina moved in. Of course they invited everybody to come and see the castle in its stunning gardens, which they all agreed was magnificent. There was one very special feature in the castle. Baxter had built an enormous library as a surprise for his wife and filled it with thousands of books from all around the world. Alvina was simply delighted. Magdalena now paused. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more like a whisper. But what the people didn't know was that my ancestor was what you call a warlock, which is to say, a male witch. Alice breathed in sharply. But, like his character, he only conjured with good, not evil. A white witch. You mean, asked Alice, her eyes widening again with excitement, he used magic? Of course, replied Magdalena. And, as if the library alone were not enough, he created 4 magic books, which were placed in the library. When read, these books brought the contents to life. They were a mixture of happy thoughts and dreams, also images of beautiful things. Trees, ponds, waterfalls, houses, animals, etc. At the incantation of a spell, the reader was able to choose whatever they wanted from the pages, and those things would physically manifest, thus allowing the individual reader to create their own reality. Alice was staring at her open-mouthed. Alvina chose many wonderful things from the books, and the castle and its grounds were filled with her beautiful choices. Colourful birds that roosted in the trees, deer that roamed the gardens, music that played from thin air, and a pretty summer house that the 2 of them would use when the weather was pleasant. Life was wonderful. Until one terrible day, Alvina suddenly fell very sick. Baxter tried to cure her with potions and spells, but nothing worked. And within a month, Alvina had died. Alice felt a sudden pang of sadness in her heart. Just then, her eye was caught by movement outside the great windows. She turned to see a large black bird fluttering outside, its beak tapping against the window. "Look at that," said Magdalena, a shrill of interest in her voice. "It's a raven. It looks like it wants in." Magdalena laughed. "Yes, it does rather, doesn't it?" At that point, the raven flew off. Anyway, as I was saying, Alvina died. Baxter was beyond consolation. He shut himself away in his castle, and nobody from the outside ever saw him again. Every day he would sit brooding, and every day the beautiful things that Alvina had taken from the magic books reminded him of her. He could not bear it, and so he created a spell that would banish them all back into the pages. Unfortunately, Baxter's grief was so strong that the spell not only sucked his wife's choices back in, it sucked every happy thought, every cloudless day, every sunset, even laughter, in with them. Baxter Bloodworth slowly began to fade, and shortly before his death he wrote these memoirs. Because of his sadness, he locked the Enchanted Library and never went in again. One day, however, he realized he needed to correct what he had done wrong, and so began to look for the spell that would release everything again. But he could not find it. He spent the rest of his days searching for it. The last words in his memoir were, "To whomever reads this, do not give up the search for this spell, for unless it is found, the people of Crowgable, those I once tried to help, will live in misery forever, as I will. Even in death I will not rest until I have given them their happiness once more." My ancestor died 2 days later. She smiled at Alice now. I was the only one out of my family that smiled. And when I heard you sing, I couldn't believe my ears. And you smiled too. That's why I wanted to tell you. I've been looking for the spell for many years now, but I cannot find it. It is like looking for a hairpin in a haystack. I too am a witch, and I wish very much to reverse what Baxter did. But I am getting old. I have no children. I need to teach somebody what I know, somebody who will continue to use magic for good. And I think, young Alice, that you are the one. You were born with laughter and happiness in you, like I was. "You're going to teach me the way of the witch?" gasped Alice. "If you are willing, yes." "When can I start?" The carriage went over a bump in the road and jolted Alice out of her memory. She saw that they were now in the Gable woods. She sighed and wiped a strand of hair out of her face. Magdalena had taken her into the Enchanted Library. It was the most incredible place Alice had ever seen, vast with different sections. One section had an enormous fireplace with a stag's head directly above it. There were stairs to high-up walkways, and the whole place had smelt of leather and parchment. Alice had not been able to stop twisting her head this way and that. She had shown her the enchanted books too. "Here they are," she had said. They were huge books, bound in red leather. "These really came to life?" she asked. "According to the story." Over the next few years, Magdalena had taught Alice how to use witchcraft. She had learned fast and been an excellent pupil. And now Magdalena was relying on her to use everything she now knew to save her life. The carriage rattled on through the woods towards Bloodworth Castle. The coachman was wary, although the horse seemed placid. He didn't notice that the carriage had an extra passenger. Sitting on the roof was a large black raven. The coachman drew up outside the main gate. "This is your stop," he shouted, "and I'm not stopping long." Alice jumped out. She paid the driver and watched as he quickly turned the horse around and charged off into the night. Alice entered the castle. There was absolute silence. Luckily, the lamps were still burning. She made her way quickly up the stairs and along the familiar corridors to a large pair of double oak doors. Behind them was the library. She took the key from her pocket and fitted it into the lock. It was a while since she had last been in here, and as she entered, the smell of all those books came to her senses once again. She closed the door behind her. Magdalena had said that her notes were on the table by the fire. She headed there now. Sure enough, on the table, next to a still smouldering log, were a small pile of papers, and next to those were the enchanted books. Alice took off her cloak and bag and sat down at the table. She took up the papers and began to read through them. On the last page was the spell Magdalena believed would activate the books. It was short and simple. Alice began to prepare for an immediate incantation, for there was no time to be lost in this matter. She removed the candles and herbs from her bag. She placed the candles in a circle round the table. A taper was lying nearby, and she put one end of it in the fire, then lit the wicks. She scattered a handful of herbs on top of the books. Alice now closed her eyes and grounded herself, before reading the spell aloud. "By the howl of the hound and the serpent's slither, by the ancient mound and winter's shiver, I order these books to release their magic." She now threw a pinchful of herbs over the candle flames, so that they began to burn, and as she did so, intoned, "So mote it be, so mote it be." After a moment, she opened the first book. She had to remember that what she was looking for was not the original content, but everything else that had been sucked in by the strength of Mactor's spell, the happiness and light of the surrounding area. But how would she find that? Would they have imprinted themselves on the physical pages, like everything else? Would there be a scent, a feeling, a distinct aura? She didn't know. All she could do was look. But they were large books. And that was the other thing. Had the energy been sucked into just one of the books, or all of them? She decided to test, first of all, whether the spell had actually unlocked the magic in the first place. She found an image of an owl and put her finger in it, then tapped twice. It was apparently what you did. But nothing happened. She bit her lip and frowned. She tapped harder, still nothing. "Oh no," she thought. "Tell me she's worked out the spell correctly," she muttered. She chose another image and tapped twice on it as well. Nothing. Then she tried just pressing her finger down on the image and holding it there for a couple of seconds. Still nothing. Maybe she had to repeat the spell for each item. She went back to the owl, incanted the spell, then tapped twice. And once again, nothing happened. "Something's wrong," she said. "This should work." She looked again at Magdalena's notes. Maybe she had got it wrong. It was perfectly possible. But what now? "Now I have to work it out myself." "Come on, Alice," she said to herself. "Use everything she's taught you. A spell is like a recipe. You cannot just cook it up first time and expect a perfect dish. You need to be a good cook. You need to understand what you're doing, why you put in the ingredients. But first, cleanse. Cleanse yourself and the space. Burn the herbs and meditate." She took another handful of herbs, and this time threw them on the fire. Then she sat cross-legged in front of it and closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of the herbs. She envisioned a quiet space in her mind and stayed like that for the next 10 minutes. Once that was done, she got up and went to the north side of the space. Then she pointed her finger and began turning round in circles, chanting the words, "I cast this circle to create a sacred space. No unwanted energies can enter this space." White light shot out from her finger and formed, as she turned, a glowing circle around the table and herself. The circle is now cast. So mote it be. A sudden harsh sound made her jump in fright, a cawing and flapping. She turned, startled, and saw the raven alighting on the floor, just outside the circle. "How did you get in?" "I suppose there must have been a window open." The raven cawed again. "You'll need to go. You can't stay here." She paused. "And yet, surely I've seen you before, when Magdalena first showed me around the castle." The bird seemed to caw in response. Alice frowned. "But that was years ago. Why are you here now?" "Caw," said the raven. It cocked its head. "Caw," it said again. "I don't talk bird," said Alice. "If I did, I'd understand what you were saying." The raven flew up onto the table now. It began pecking gently at the books. "Careful with those," said Alice. "They're very old." "Caw," Alice sighed. "Great. I've got a big raven interrupting my work." She clapped her hands. "Come on, out." The raven flew off the table, but instead of flying cleanly away, it crashed headlong into a nearby bookshelf, knocking several of the books to the floor. Alice gasped and ran over. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was my fault. I scared you." "You don't need to be scared. I just wanted you to go. I have an extremely important assignment to complete, you see." She sighed. "Are you hurt?" "Caw." "You seem all right." She began picking the books off the floor. As she did, a piece of parchment slipped out from one of them. She picked it up and looked at it, and her eyes widened. Written in hand, at the top of the page, was a title. "Spell for the enchanted books," she whispered. "I don't believe it. It was here all along." She looked at the raven. "Thank you," she said in half amusement. "If you hadn't crashed into the shelf, I would never have known it was here." She took the parchment over to the table and sat down with it. The raven followed. This time it sat quietly on the table, watching her intently. "Magdalena nearly had it right." "I wonder," she said, talking to the raven now. "This handwriting looks feminine. Was this written by Alvina? Maybe it was her copy that she kept nearby in case she forgot it." "Caw." She smiled at the bird. "What are you doing here, you silly thing?" Alice sighed and turned her attention back to the spell. "All right, let's try this again." By the light of the moon and the salt of the sea, by the ancient rune and the old oak tree, I order these books to release their magic. So mote it be, so mote it be. Alice held her breath. "Here goes," she thought. She tapped once again on the image of the owl. There was a sudden flash and a puff of wind, and the next second a beautiful barn owl was sitting next to the raven on the table. "Yes!" shrieked Alice in delight. The owl fluffed its feathers and seemed to puff out its chest as if looking very pleased with itself. The raven cawed loudly. "Thank God it works!" She quickly tapped on another image, not thinking about what it was. Another flash and a puff of wind, and a large tabby cat also appeared on the table. "Oh, crap!" The owl squawked in fright and flew off onto the bookshelf. "Meow," said the tabby. The raven remained completely composed as it peered at its mortal enemy, which started to lick its paw. Alice sighed with relief and shook her head. "Concentrate, Alice. Keep your head, or some birds might lose theirs." She breathed out slowly. "So, I've found the spell. I know how to initiate it. Now to retrieve what I need to retrieve." She began flipping through the book, looking for any signs, but she just had no idea what to look for. "How do I find these natural elements? It seems that if there were any specific way of retrieving what should not have been captured in the first place, Baxter Bloodworth would have noted it in his memoirs, and yet Magdalena doesn't suggest anything in her own notes. Alice thought for a moment. What if I create my own spell? What if I ask for the natural elements to be removed automatically? That way I don't have to waste time in searching. Alice smiled to herself and nodded. The protective circle had already been cast. The herbs had been burned. All that was required now was to come up with the words. Once you knew your intention, casting a spell was pretty simple, except that the words did need to flow with the mystical currents in the atmosphere at the time the spell was being cast, or it wouldn't work. Probably the reason Magdalena's hadn't worked. It was like putting a key into a lock. The key had to line up with the grooves. These mystical currents could be altered by the phase of the moon, the strength of the wind, or even the temperature. It was often a delicate balance that a witch needed to get right if she were to successfully cast a spell. Alice closed her eyes. She now began to put out her feelers, like a pair of invisible whiskers that could pick up the slightest changes in atmosphere. What are your currents doing tonight, Mother Earth? Her body began to tingle, and as it did, the words for the spell began to form in her mind. By the green man's power and the witch's brew, by the April shower and the tale of the shrew, I remove nature's gifts from these ancient pages. So mote it be, so mote it be. The floor beneath Alice began to shake violently, as if an earthquake were happening. The cat panicked and the raven flew off the table. What now? Squeaked Alice, grabbing onto her chair. Suddenly the wall opposite her seemed to explode inwards as something burst through it. It was a large tree branch, covered in moss. And the next moment grass began sprouting up from under the floorboards. Ivy appeared on the bookshelves, creeping up the sides. "Oh, cripes," she said. And then there was a swooshing and roaring as water began cascading down the stairs from the levels above and pouring over the sides. Alice shrieked in fright as she grabbed up the book and shoved it under her arm. She stuffed it into her bag and put the others in with it. It was imperative they were safe. She now tried to make for the door. Water was swirling round her ankles, and she found herself wading through floating books and old manuscripts. She wished she could save them. She saw the cat cling to a bookshelf, its eyes wide with fear. It meowed frantically. Then suddenly she saw the door ahead. It was blocked by an enormous tree trunk that was growing out of one of the shelves. "No!" She waded as fast as she could. The doors opened inwards. There was no way she could get out. "This can't be happening!" The raven alighted on the trunk and cawed at her, flapping its wings at the same time. It appeared to be as agitated as she was. "What do I do?" Water was pouring down each staircase. "How do I stop this?" she cried to the raven, as if it had the answer. "Caw!" It certainly seemed to be trying to tell her something. Magdalena sat in the condemned cell, her chin on her hand, as she leaned her elbow on a little table. How was Alice getting on, she wondered. The last she'd seen of her was on Sunday night. Would she succeed? She must do. It was not really a very difficult task she had set her, not with all the girl knew. Just then, she heard heavy footsteps coming along the corridor. They stopped outside her cell. There was the jangling of a bunch of keys, and the door swung open to reveal the jailer and the magistrate. The latter strolled into the cell. Magdalena stood up. Did he have the books? "I just came to remind you that at noon tomorrow you will hang, and to ask if you have any final requests." "My request is simple. Allow me to speak in my own defence. Judgment has already been passed, unfairly." The magistrate scowled at her. "Don't tell me my business, witch. You're right. I am a witch, but I use good magic, not bad." "So, you freely admit it, then?" "Did you hear what I said?" "I said I use good magic." "It makes no difference," replied the magistrate. "How is that?" asked Magdalena defiantly. "Condemnation should not be based on whether someone is a witch or not. Rather, it should be based on whether that person is doing harm to people. But you are doing harm to people, woman. That is the point. I am not responsible for the weather, you fool, nor the melancholy. I am the one trying to bring it all back, to restore what was taken away. But I cannot do that if I am not given the opportunity." "I will listen to no more of this," snapped the magistrate. "As far as I and the people of this town are concerned, everything will be restored to order just as soon as your legs stop twitching." With that, the magistrate turned and stormed out of the cell, the jailer pulling the door shut behind him with a bang. Magdalena sat down heavily on the little stool and put her head on her hands. "Come on, Alice," she said to herself. The night passed with no news from Alice. With every hour, Magdalena felt the hope draining away from her, and with it, her life. The next morning, when the jailer came with her breakfast, he grinned nastily at her. "This is your last day on earth, hag. Enjoy it." He dumped the plate down on the table. "It's going to be unpleasant, you know. I've seen the rope. It's thick and scratchy. By the time you die, it will have rubbed your neck raw." "Leave me alone," snapped Magdalena. "You're a vile little man with no care or respect for life." The jailer soured visibly. His face curdled. "You think I don't care? You're wrong. I care, but only for decent folk. Folk who have suffered under your spells, but continue to get on with their lives, continue with their struggles and torments. I've had plenty of those." "I know," said Magdalena more gently. "I know about your wife's illness, and your attempts to look after her and the children." The jailer's face had changed. "How do you—" "I'm a witch, remember? And if I were not dying today, I would be able to help you. I wish I could." The jailer swallowed. He went silent for a moment. "So do I," he said quietly. Magdalena sighed. "I didn't mean what I said." "Forget it," replied the jailer. "I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. Anyway, I've had far worse." He pointed to the plate. "Enjoy your breakfast." His voice sounded sincere. The hours now seemed to speed up. In no time at all, she heard a whole host of boots, and when the cell door opened, 2 guards walked in. One of them had a rope. With them was the magistrate. Magdalena's hands were bound behind her. "Let's go, witch! Your time is up." She could already hear the crowd outside, baying for her blood. Where was Alice? They led her downstairs and outside. The gallows stood but a few yards in front. Soldiers kept the way clear. When the crowd saw Magdalena, they began to cheer even louder. Curses were shouted in her direction, and rotting vegetables were hurled at her. After all, the fields were full of them. She was led up the short flight of wooden steps onto the platform, where the hangman stood in his rough clothes. His expression was bleak. A low stool, much like the one she'd been sitting on for the past few days, stood directly beneath the dangling noose. "Can you step up?" asked the executioner. "Or do you require assistance?" Magdalena ignored him and stepped boldly onto the stool. As the rope was placed around her neck, her eyes roamed frantically over the crowd, looking for any sign of Alice, but the girl was nowhere to be seen. So that was it, thought Magdalena. This truly was the end. At least she had tried. "Magdalena Bloodworth," came the magistrate's voice, "you have been sentenced to death for the practice of witchcraft. Do you have any final words?" Magdalena lowered her head. The magistrate was about to raise his hand as a signal to the executioner, when a distinct voice made itself heard in the crowd. "I do," it chirped. Magdalena's head snapped up. "Alice?" The girl had come out of the crowd. She now stepped forward towards the scaffold. "Alice!" cried Magdalena. The magistrate frowned down at her. "And what is that?" "Make a wish," said Alice. "I beg your pardon?" "Make a wish," she shouted. "We do not have time for games, young lady. We are in the middle of an execution." "You were." "Not any more." "What?" "I say again, make a wish." The magistrate sighed. "I suppose there is a point to all this, Miss Birdwhistle. Alice Birdwhistle. Well, Miss Birdwhistle, I wish that this town wasn't so gloomy." The crowd cheered. Alice removed something now from the folds of her coat. It was a carved tobacco box. "What is in there?" demanded the magistrate. "Your wish," replied Alice. In an instant, Alice had opened the lid, and a stream of sparkling light poured from it into the sky. The crowd gasped with a mix of fear and fascination as they watched the light trail shoot up into the clouds and disappear. A moment later, the clouds began flickering as if in a lightning storm. As they did, they gradually became thinner, eventually turning to mere vapour, before disappearing entirely in the glare of a brilliant hot sun. And in that newly established light, the townsfolk began to see the cracks in the cobbles disappear. Dead flowers in old window boxes began to spring to life, and the long, dried-up fountain in the square spurted out water in a sudden gush. "What in the name of—" began the magistrate, but a sound suddenly cut him off. It was the sound of somebody laughing, and it wasn't coming from Alice. The executioner was standing quaking with laughter. The sound was taken up by people in the crowd now, at first just a handful, and then the entire congregation. The magistrate stared, unable to speak. And all at once, he too began to laugh. "Take that noose from around her neck, for goodness sake," he said, in between laughs. The executioner willingly obliged. This time he didn't ask if Magdalena needed a hand. He gave her one anyway. "That," said Magdalena, "is my pupil. Tell them, Alice." Alice turned to the crowd. "Good people of Crowgable," she shouted, "may I have your attention?" "I think you already have that," said the magistrate. As the crowd listened, Alice told them the story of Baxter Bloodworth. She then explained what Magdalena had been trying to do. She took the bag from her shoulders now and removed the books. She held them up high for the townsfolk to see. "These are the enchanted books." "Is Mr. Bowbrick here?" she shouted. "I am," he called, coming forward now. "What did you say you wished for? 100 hens?" Alice opened one of the books, sifted through a few pages, then stopped. She spoke the words of the spell, tapped twice, and all at once 100 white hens were clucking around in the square. The crowd went wild. Mr. Bowbrick nearly fell over. "It isn't possible," he gasped. "Of course it is. It's magic." Mr. Bowbrick was shaking his head. "They're yours," said Alice. She turned to a woman at the front. "Madam," she said, "what do you wish for?" "A dozen brown loaves," she said. Alice laughed. Again she shuffled through a couple of pages, and soon a basket full of fresh bread lay at the woman's feet. "It is thanks to Magdalena and her ancestor that we have access to our wishes and dreams. No longer will any of you want for anything. These books will be placed back in the library, but you may come to Aunt Magdalena any time you want and make a request. Of course, maybe not when she's trying to sleep." The crowd roared with laughter. It really was extraordinary to hear it. Magdalena now descended the steps and ran over to Alice, flinging her arms around her. "You did it!" Alice smiled. "I had a bit of help," she said. "Oh?" said Magdalena. "Ladies," interrupted the magistrate, "I insist you both have dinner in my lodgings this evening." "We would love to," replied Alice. "But may I bring a friend?" "Of course you can, my dear girl. Of course you can." That evening, Magdalena and Alice sat as guests of honour at a long table covered in food and drink. The town elders were all there, and perched next to Alice on the tabletop sat a large raven, pecking happily at a piece of meat. "When you said a friend, I didn't expect a bird," said the magistrate good-humouredly. That alien sound rippled around the table. "Laughter," he continued. "How good it is to hear it. How good it is to see the people happy again. Listen to them. The celebrations are still going on." The window was open, and through it floated the sounds of merriment coming from the main square. "I'm sure they will go on for many more days," said one of the elders. The magistrate stood up now. He turned to face Magdalena. "My dear woman, allow me to profusely apologize to you for what I have done. I accept your apology, Lord Springfield." The magistrate simply beamed at her. "Truly," he said, "I have never felt this contented in my life. Crowgable has been released from its dark prison after many, many years, and for that we are eternally grateful to you." "There is one other person you need to thank for this," said Alice. "Oh?" said the magistrate. "Who is that?" Alice smiled. "Alvina Bloodworth." The magistrate frowned. "But she died many moons ago. That does not mean they cannot still help. Isn't that right, Alvina?" All of a sudden, the raven began to flap its great wings. As it did, it seemed to grow larger. As it grew, its shape changed from bird to human, and before the elders knew it, a beautiful woman in a flowing black dress was standing before them. The magistrate gaped. The elders dropped their cutlery almost entirely at the same time. "Good evening, gentlemen," said the woman. "I am Alvina. Or perhaps I should say the spirit of Alvina. For as you said, I died many moons ago. But I kept watch on my husband from the world beyond this one, and saw his grief. I saw the terrible mistake he had made, and I promised myself I would not truly rest until I had helped correct it, because only that would free my husband's spirit from his torment and let us be together again. Since the day he died, he has been trapped in a dark limbo, much like this town has been, unable to see or hear me, unable to move on. Tonight, I shall be finally reunited with my love. I appear, normally, in the form of a raven, for the raven is a symbol of prophecy. And my prophecy was that somebody would eventually come to Bloodworth Castle with the power to reverse what happened. And it would be a girl. She did very well. Alvina looked at Alice with a kind smile, even if she does need a little more practice. I aided her a little. So now it is all done, and I wish all of you peace and joy in your hearts for the rest of your lives. At which Alvina's spirit evaporated like a mist into the floor.